Club owner said no reservation for you at the door. Unaware she owned the building he was renting, no reservation, no entry. And frankly, looking at you, I don't think you'd be comfortable in there anyway. He said it the way men like him always said things. Not loudly, not with heat, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had never once been questioned. His name was Preston Caldwell, and he stood at the Velvet Rope of Obsidian, the most exclusive private supper club in the Meridian district of Atlanta, in a charcoal blazer that cost more than Ian's most Peter car payments, with his chin tilted just enough to look down without appearing to try. The woman standing in front of him was dressed in a cream wool coat, her natural hair gathered softly at the crown, a single strand of freshwater pearls at her throat. She had not raised her voice. She had not moved. She simply looked at him with dark, steady eyes and waited. He leaned forward and added, almost as an afterthought, "The kitchen staff entrance is around back, if that's what you're looking for." The woman's name was Claudette Renee Okafor. She did not flinch. She did not look at the sidewalk. She did not turn around. She held her small leather clutch in both hands and breathed once, slowly, through her nose. Her heels were planted on the sidewalk, the way a person stands when they know exactly where they belong. What Preston Caldwell did not know, what he could not have imagined standing there in his blazer, with his chin tilted just so, was that the building he operated his supper club out of, the 4-story converted warehouse on Meridian and 5th that he had spent 3 years decorating with reclaimed wood and imported brass fixtures, the building whose lease he signed every January with a signature that felt like authority. That building had a landlord, and that landlord was standing right in front of him. What happened in the next 45 minutes would end his career, his lease, and the particular brand of confidence he had spent his entire adult life assembling. But that was 8 seconds ago, and the 8 seconds before it would not let her go. "Yo, hold on," he really said that, to her face, standing at the door of a building she owns. Man, the audacity is something else entirely. Let's get all the way into this. Claudette Renee Okafor was born in the Vine City neighborhood of Atlanta in the spring of 1971, the second of 3 daughters raised by a woman named Miriam Okafor, who cleaned office buildings Monday through Saturday and pressed her daughters' school clothes every Sunday night without exception, laying them across the kitchen chairs while the iron breathed steam into the cold apartment air. The apartment they lived in was on the 3rd floor of a building whose elevator had not worked since 1978. The window in the bedroom Claudette shared with her sisters had a gap at the sill where the winter came through, and Miriam kept a folded dish towel pressed against it from November through March. The radiator knocked all night long. The heat came and went according to a schedule that served someone else's convenience. There was never quite enough of anything. Food stretched across the week the way fabric stretches when you need to cover more than the material intends. The heels of the bread were breakfast. Church shoes were worn carefully, kept in boxes made to last. The cracked tablet screen was taped and taped again. But Miriam Okafor was a woman of extraordinary specificity about what she wanted, and she communicated that specificity to her daughters through repetition and example. And what she wanted, underneath everything, was a permanent address for the life she was building. She kept a Bible on the kitchen table and a spiral notebook beside it. Every evening after dinner she would write in that notebook, not prayers exactly, but something between prayers and plans. She wrote down what she wanted for her daughters. Education, she wrote. Property. She wrote the word land in capital letters on the inside cover of that notebook and circled it 3 times with her ballpoint pen. She told her daughters that a woman who owned land owned something no one could take from her on a Tuesday morning when the landlord decided to raise the rent. She said it in exactly those words. The Tuesday morning was specific. She had lived through a Tuesday morning like that. Claudette read the notebook when she was 11 years old and understood it as wishes. She read it again at 17 and understood it as a plan. She graduated from Spelman College in 1993 with a degree in economics and a minor in real estate finance that her academic advisor had tried to talk her out of, suggesting she would find accounting a more stable path. She thanked him for his time, held the expression on her face very steady, and enrolled in the minor the following morning. She sat in every class. She took complete notes. She asked questions that sometimes made her professors pause before answering. She took her first job after graduation at a commercial property management firm on Peachtree Street, a company called Hargrove Dutton that managed a portfolio of mid-size commercial properties across Atlanta and its inner suburbs. She was the only black woman in the office at a professional level. The receptionist, a white woman named Sandra, who had been with the firm for 12 years, asked Claudette on her first morning whether she was there to interview for the cleaning contract. Claudette said, politely and without any visible emotion, that she was reporting for her first day in the acquisitions department. Sandra said, "Oh." The conversation ended there. Claudette found her desk, sat down, and went to work. She spent 11 years at Hargrove Dutton learning exactly what she had come to learn. She watched deals move from initial contact, through due diligence, through closing. She watched who controlled the notes, and who controlled the deeds. She watched how wealth in this city accumulated inside certain families and drained away from others along lines that were not accidental but architectural, built into the zoning maps and the lending policies, and the quiet understandings of who was and was not expected to be an owner in particular neighborhoods. She watched men with far less knowledge than she'd get promoted over her twice. She noted it. She filed it. She kept working. In 2003, she was passed over for a senior position she had every credential for. The position was given to a man named Gerald Fairchild, who had been with the firm for 18 months, and who asked Claudette, in their first interaction after his promotion, whether she could show him where the copier was. She showed him where the copier was. She went back to her desk. She updated her resume that evening. In 2004, she gave her 2 weeks' notice, shook hands with the people who deserved handshakes, and left. She took her savings, the bulk of them deposited over 11 years into a credit union account that Miriam had helped her open when she was 9 years old, $20 at a time until it became something real. And she bought a distressed duplex in the Edgewood neighborhood for $62,000. The property needed work. She did as much of it herself as she could, learning from YouTube videos and library books and a plumber named Earl, who lived 2 streets over and would explain things if you asked him direct questions and brought him coffee. She regrouted the bathroom tiles herself. She sealed the window frames herself. She painted the interiors herself over 3 consecutive weekends, working from 8 in the morning until the light went, with a radio on the floor and sandwiches from the gas station. She rented both units within 6 weeks. She reinvested the income. She did it again and again. By 2009, she owned 4 properties. By 2013, she owned 11. By 2016, when Miriam Okafor's doctor told Miriam that her knees were not going to carry her up those 3 flights much longer, Claudette bought a house in Cascade Heights, a quiet street, a porch that caught the afternoon light, a kitchen that stayed warm. She and her sisters drove Miriam to the new house on a Saturday in October, and Miriam walked through every room and did not say much. And when she reached the kitchen, she pressed both hands flat on the countertop and stood there for a long moment with her eyes closed. Then she opened them and said, "This is a good kitchen." Claudette said it was. That was enough. She kept growing the portfolio. She structured her acquisitions through limited liability companies, quiet legal entities that kept her name off the front-facing paperwork. Her attorney, Marcus Webb, had counseled this approach both for tax reasons and for the simple practical reason that being a black woman in Atlanta, commercial real estate meant that certain sellers, certain brokers, and certain counterparties behaved differently when they knew who they were dealing with, and that the behavior tended to work against her financially. She preferred to do business on level terms and correct the record afterward if necessary. By 2019, when she quietly acquired the 4-story converted warehouse on Meridian and 5th through Meridian 5th Holdings, LLC, her portfolio comprised 43 properties across Fulton and DeKalb counties, with a combined assessed value that her accountant described, after a long and unusually quiet silence, as generational. The building at Meridian and 5th was one of her larger acquisitions. She had watched it sit undervalued for 4 years, had watched its roof replaced by its previous owner, had watched the zoning shift in that corridor as the Meridian district began its decade-long transformation into a destination. She moved when the number was right. In 2020, a hospitality operator named Preston Caldwell approached Meridian 5th Holdings about leasing the ground and mezzanine floors. He wanted to open a private supper club. His track record included 2 previous venues, one of which had been profitable and one of which had not. His financial statements were adequate. His references checked out. His concept was polished and detailed, and the renderings he presented showed exactly the kind of establishment that would perform well in that corridor. Marcus reviewed the lease, structured the compliance requirements carefully, and Claudette signed off on the tenancy. Preston Caldwell signed the lease with Meridian Fifth Holdings, LLC. He had never asked who was behind the LLC. His attorney had reviewed the entity and found it in order. Neither of them had looked further. Men who build things inside spaces they rent often develop a particular kind of myopia about the walls they are decorating. Obsidian opened in the fall of 2020 and was, by every visible measure, a success. Press coverage, the right mentions, the right clientele, a waiting list for reservations. Preston Caldwell circulated through his room on Friday nights in his blazer, greeting guests whose names he remembered, whose bottles he comped when the occasion warranted it, whose social media posts he quietly tracked. He was good at this. He had built his identity entirely around being the kind of man who ran rooms like this one. He believed in the architecture of prestige, in the way certain spaces communicated who belonged inside them, and he used that belief to curate his door accordingly. Claudette had received the first compliance notice back from her property manager in early November. The ventilation system on the second floor had been modified without a permit. The fire suppression line on the mezzanine had been partially capped, apparently to accommodate a structural alteration Preston had made to the bar installation, and the cap had not been inspected. 3 emergency exit signs had been removed from the main room, and when the property manager asked the facility's contact about them, he was told that Preston had wanted a cleaner aesthetic and that the signs would be reinstalled if required. The property manager had sent the first notice via certified mail. It was signed for by someone at the Obsidian office on a Thursday morning. No response came. The second notice went out 3 weeks later. Certified mail again, and a follow-up email to the business address listed on the lease. The email was opened, read receipt confirmed, and not answered. The third notice went out 2 weeks after that, this time copied to the email address Preston himself had provided as an emergency contact. Marcus attached a letter to the third notice explaining that failure to respond within 14 days would initiate a formal breach process. No response. The rent payment that month was 11 days late. Miriam's notebook had taught Claudette many things, but one of the things her years in property had taught her was that late payments and ignored notices often came from the same source, a tenant who had decided, consciously or otherwise, that the person they owed the obligation to was someone they did not need to take seriously. She had seen this pattern before. She knew what usually came next. She decided to go in person. She called the Obsidian Reservations line at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon and made a reservation for that evening under her own name. She drove to the Meridian district, parked 2 blocks from the building, and walked to the entrance in her cream coat and her pearls. She had dressed with care, not because she needed to impress anyone, but because she always dressed with care. It was the standard she held for herself. It had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. She arrived at 9:40 in the evening. Preston Caldwell was at the rope. She had recognized him from photographs her property manager had forwarded. He had not recognized her from anything, because there was nothing to recognize her from. She was, to him, simply a woman who had arrived at his door without an appointment in his world. He told her there was no reservation. He told her she would not be comfortable inside. He told her the kitchen entrance was around back. He said all of this in less than 15 seconds, with a hand gesture that was not quite a wave but communicated the same thing, a small unhurried motion that indicated the direction she was supposed to go. She did not go in that direction. What Claudette did instead was step 3 feet to her left and take out her phone. The phone was not for calling anyone. Not yet. She opened the notes application and began to write down the time, the exact words she had just heard, and the name of the door staff member, standing 2 feet away, who had chosen to find the sidewalk interesting. The notes would be relevant later. Then she stood under the awning of her own building in the November night air, and she waited. Her heels were still planted. Her hands were folded over her clutch. If you had driven past and seen her, you might have thought she was simply a woman waiting for a car. You would not have known, from her posture or her expression, that anything had happened at all. She had built that stillness over a long time. It had cost her something, learning to hold herself like that under pressure. There were years when she had not been able to hold herself like that. The year the Hargrove Dutton promotion went to Gerald Fairchild. She had driven home and sat in her parked car outside her apartment for 20 minutes, hands on the wheel, not going anywhere, just breathing. The year a seller in Decatur had refused 3 times to take her calls and then accepted an offer $10,000 lower from a buyer who looked nothing like her. She had called Miriam and cried while Miriam listened without rushing her. The stillness she carried now was not numbness. It was something Miriam had once described as knowing where you stand on the ground. You do not need anyone else to confirm the ground is there. A couple arrived at the rope while Claudette stood there. They were white, mid-40s, the woman in a deep green halter gown, and the man in a dark suit with a silk pocket square. Preston's entire posture changed the moment he saw them. The chin came back up. The voice came back warm. He said their names before they reached the rope. He knew them, had clearly been expecting them, and he unlatched the rope with a sweep of his arm and walked them inside himself, a hand at the small of the woman's back, laughing at something the man said. The door closed. The jazz went muffled behind it. Keith, the door staff member, had resumed his position at the rope. He did not look at Claudette. He looked at the middle distance with the careful expression of a man who has decided that what he is watching is not something he is watching. 2 minutes passed. A car dropped off another couple. They were also white, also dressed expensively, and Preston was back at the rope in time to greet them. He glanced at Claudette as he led this couple in and said, in a tone that was not quite public and not quite private, "Ma'am, I've asked you to move along. I won't ask again." Then he went inside. The couple had heard it. They glanced at each other and went through the door without looking back. Claudette pressed her thumb and forefinger together inside the palm of her left hand, the way Miriam had taught her to do when she was small, and something was making her feel like her chest would crack open. She breathed. She held the phone steady. She kept her notes. Preston noticed her still present after a few more minutes. He came back outside, and his face had shifted from dismissal to a low-grade irritation, the expression of a man for whom persistent inconveniences were an affront to the natural order. "Ma'am, you're going to need to move along. You're obstructing the entrance for our guests." She was standing 6 feet from the rope, on the public sidewalk, not obstructing anything. She said calmly, "I have a reservation." He said he had already told her that. She said he had not asked her name. A brief calculation crossed his face. He pulled out his tablet from inside his blazer, scrolled, looked. The reservation was there under Okafor, clear as anything. She watched him see it. She watched him consider it. She watched him decide, as men in his position sometimes decided when the choice was between truth and the impression they had invested too much to abandon, that the truth was the less convenient option. He told her there had been a last-minute adjustment for a private event and that he could not accommodate her this evening. He said it with the smooth, almost musical cadence of a man who had deployed that exact sentence before and had never once been held accountable for deploying it. A woman passing on the sidewalk with a small dog on a leash had slowed almost imperceptibly. She had heard the exchange. She and Claudette made brief eye contact. The woman looked at Preston, then back at Claudette, then moved on, looking at the ground. Keith was finding his shoes interesting again. She said, "I understand." She stepped back, and this time she called Marcus Webb. Marcus was already inside the building. She had asked him to arrive at 9, have a drink, get a look at the space, note the condition of the emergency exit areas. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Come outside. Bring your briefcase." The briefcase had been her request. Marcus had raised an eyebrow when she asked, because they were not typically the kind of attorney-client relationship that required props. She had said, "Bring the briefcase." He had brought it. Inside Obsidian, the amber light held everything in its warm suspension. The jazz quartet in the far corner was deep into their second set, a long, slow version of something with a patient bass line underneath it. The room held perhaps 80 people, most of them in the particular register of Atlanta money, that arrived in cars they would never have to park themselves, that ordered bottles before looking at the menu, that spoke to servers in the specific clipped tone of people who had long ago stopped thinking about what it was like to carry a tray. The reclaimed wood gleamed. The brass fixtures caught the light. The velvet booths held their conversations like cupped palms. A server named Destiny Wright had been watching the window. She had worked at Obsidian for 14 months. In 14 months, she had watched a specific thing happen at that door 7 times. Always with the same unhurried certainty. Always with the same shooing motion that Preston seemed not to know he was making. She had filed a complaint about the broader pattern 6 months ago, with the HR coordinator, a woman named Janet who had listened carefully, taken notes, told Destiny that the company took these concerns very seriously, and done nothing. Janet had filed the complaint in a folder in a drawer in her desk and typed resolved. No further action needed into the company's internal system. Destiny had kept copies of everything. She had a friend who had told her once that documentation was the only receipt that paid out. She kept the emails. She had been keeping her phone ready for months, in the specific quiet way of someone who understands that the moment you are waiting to document will not announce itself in advance. When the woman in the cream coat was turned away at the door, Destiny moved to the window. When Preston came over with his hand gesture, she pressed record. The glass reduced the sound but not the image. Preston's face was visible. His posture was visible. The small shooing motion was very visible. And when Marcus came out of the building in his jacket with his briefcase and placed 3 documents on the surface of the host stand, that was visible too. And the moment Preston Caldwell's chin came down from where it had been sitting all evening, that was the clearest image of all. Destiny held the phone steady. She did not need to hurry. She waited until the documents were on the table, and then she stopped recording. Then she texted the video to her own email, then to a friend, then to her cousin, who ran a platform with 240,000 followers, and a particular interest in exactly this category of story. Yo, the briefcase. She asked him to bring the briefcase. She already knew exactly how this evening was going to go. Let's see what was in it. Marcus came outside in his jacket, buttoning it as the door closed behind him. He extended a hand to Preston Caldwell and introduced himself and the entity he represented. Preston took the handshake by reflex, the way men do before they have oriented themselves to a situation. "I'm not sure what this is about," Preston said. "If there's a billing matter, you'll need our business manager." Marcus said it was not a billing matter. He said there was the question of 3 unanswered compliance notices, a late payment that had triggered a specific clause on page 4 of the lease, and an event that had occurred at the entrance in the last several minutes that his client intended to document formally. Preston said the word client as a question. Marcus said this is Claudette Okafor. She is the managing member of Meridian Fifth Holdings, LLC. She is Mr. Caldwell, your landlord. The street held that sentence for a moment. A car passed. Down the block, a restaurant door opened and breathed music into the air before closing again. The night was the particular Atlanta cool of late autumn. Not cold, but no longer forgiving. Preston Caldwell's face did the thing faces do when the architecture a person has been standing in turns out to be a set. When the confidence that was holding everything in place turns out to have been borrowed. His chin came down. His hands, which had been easy at his sides, found each other and then separated again. His color did not go red. It went something more specific than red. It went the gray of a man who is very rapidly reviewing a series of decisions he cannot unmake. Marcus opened the briefcase on the host stand. He laid the documents out in a single unhurried row. The lease with the notarized disclosure identifying Claudette as sole managing member of Meridian Fifth Holdings, LLC. The 3 compliance notices with their certified mail receipts, each one stamped received, each one followed by silence. And the late payment ledger, clean and precise, with the relevant clause highlighted in yellow. Preston looked at the documents. He read them the way people read things they are hoping might mean something different on the second reading. He looked up once, at Claudette, and she held his eyes without expression and waited. He looked back at the documents. "I want my attorney present," he said. Marcus said absolutely, and that in the meantime his client had a reservation. Preston had no immediate response to that. He stood there with the documents in front of him, and his attorney unavailable, and the woman he had told to use the kitchen entrance standing 6 feet away looking at him with dark, steady eyes, and he had nothing left to stand behind. Claudette walked through the door of Obsidian at 9:47 in the evening. She walked slowly. She walked straight. The host, Priya, looked up from the stand and recognized the name immediately, and gathered 2 menus without being asked, and led her to a corner booth with a sight line across the full room. Marcus followed. He set the briefcase under the table and sat down. The jazz quartet was playing something patient and blue. The room smelled of cedar and candle wax, and the warm sweetness of good bourbon. The brick walls, on her building, on her land, caught the amber light and held it the way brick holds everything. Quietly, for a long time, they ordered water. Marcus ordered the bread. For a moment neither of them said anything, which was appropriate, because some moments deserve not to be rushed past. Full documentation of tonight, Claudette said. Time, exact language. Keith's position during the interaction, all of it. Marcus said already started. He had been making notes on his phone since she called him outside. Preston came in 17 minutes later. He had made calls. His attorney had not been reachable. He had made a second call to his business manager, who had pulled up the lease on his own phone in his apartment and read page 4, and called Preston back to confirm what page 4 said. Preston had stood on the sidewalk in the November air and arrived at a particular and inescapable understanding about his situation. He found her booth. He stood beside it. He did not sit. He said her name first, which was something. Her name came out carefully. The way you say a word you have learned very recently and are not yet confident you are pronouncing correctly. Mrs. Okafor, he said, I owe you an apology for the confusion at the door. Confusion, she said. He said something about a communication breakdown, about not recognizing her, about the situation being handled the wrong way. He mentioned the late evening and the volume of guests as though these were mitigating circumstances rather than irrelevant ones. He was using the grammar of apology without quite producing one, the way you can arrange all the furniture of remorse in a room without actually lighting the fire. She said the situation. He was pressing both palms flat against the side of the booth. His jaw was tight. The word he needed, the actual word, was not coming with any ease, which was fitting, because the actual word should cost something. You should feel the weight of it before you put it down. He said her treatment had been inappropriate, and that he was sorry. He said it with the intonation of a man who had rehearsed those sentences 3 times on the sidewalk and found them adequate. The word inappropriate sat in the sentence the way a small stone sits in a large room, technically present, doing almost no work. She let a silence open 3 seconds. 5. The jazz quartet had resumed. The room around them was doing what restaurant rooms do. The soft percussion of cutlery, the low music of overlapping voices. No one near the booth was watching them directly. Everyone near the booth was aware of them entirely. Preston's hand left the side of the booth, and he looked, for just a moment, like a man who was wondering if there was a way to end this interaction that cost him less than it appeared it was going to cost. There was not. She said thank you, and then she said she would need him to repeat that to his staff. All of them, everyone on the floor tonight. She said he would do that now, or she and Marcus would finish their dinner, and a formal letter would arrive from Marcus's office in the morning. And the letter would include a full documentation request regarding the building code violations and a copy of the late payment record and everything that had occurred outside this building in the last hour, time-stamped and notarized. Marcus was looking at the bread. Preston Caldwell turned to the room. The jazz quartet had paused between songs. In the particular way of restaurant rooms when the music stops, the ambient conversation had dipped, and perhaps 30 people had half-turned without quite meaning to. The human instinct towards sound when its absence is sudden. Destiny Wright was at the service station near the bar, with her arms folded and her expression absolutely still. Priya was at the host stand with her hands clasped. Keith had come inside at some point in the last few minutes and was standing near the coat room, with the studied blankness of a man who has decided his best available posture is invisibility. Preston cleared his throat. He said he needed a moment of everyone's attention. His voice was steady in the trained way, the hospitality voice, the room management voice, the voice he used when something needed to be made smooth in front of people who had paid to be here. He said that a guest had been incorrectly turned away at the entrance that evening. He said the situation had been handled very poorly. He looked in Claudette's direction, though not quite at her, and said, Ms. Okafor, you deserved better from this establishment, and I'm sorry. The room absorbed it. Destiny unfolded her arms. A woman at a nearby table looked at her dinner companion with an expression that asked a question. The companion answered with a small shrug. Priya looked at the wall above the host stand. Preston turned back to Claudette. He was waiting to be released. She said determined later, when a journalist asked him to describe her. That was the word he chose, determined. As though the problem had been her persistence rather than his conduct. As though she had been the party in need of modification. She heard about that word. She did not respond to the journalist. She had one more thing to say before she left the building that night. She stood from the booth, smoothed her coat, and looked at Preston Caldwell, who was standing nearby with the careful casualness of a man waiting to be released. She said, "The compliance notices. You have 14 days. The ventilation system, the fire suppression line, and the emergency exit signs. My property manager will schedule the inspection." He nodded, she said, "and the late fee." He nodded again. "Smaller this time," she said. "Mr. Caldwell, I hope the rest of your evening is profitable." She picked up her clutch, nodded to Marcus, and walked to the door. Priya held it open with both hands. On the sidewalk, Claudette passed the host stand, her host stand, outside her building, and did not slow down, and did not look back, and her heels were steady on the sidewalk that she had walked to 30 years. After her mother had circled a word in a notebook and meant it like a contract. Nah. She just walked out of her own building having schooled this man in front of his whole room. With pearls on, I cannot. Let's see what happened next. What happened next was not slow. Destiny's video reached her cousin's platform before midnight. By the following morning, it had been viewed 430,000 times. By noon, it had been covered by 3 Atlanta news outlets, a national entertainment site, and 2 culture-focused newsletters with significant readerships. By the evening news cycle, it was on television. The headline on the local station read, "Atlanta landlord turned away from her own building's tenant club." The segment ran 2 minutes and 40 seconds, which is a long segment for a local news story. Preston Caldwell did not comment that day. His publicist issued a statement describing the incident as an unfortunate miscommunication that was not reflective of the values of Obsidian Atlanta. The statement was read carefully by approximately 40,000 people in the first 2 hours after its posting and received with approximately the warmth you would expect from a public that had watched the video. The Obsidian reservation line rang steadily for the next 24 hours, not with new reservations, with cancellations. By day 3, the story had gathered depth because Destiny Wright had agreed to an interview with a local journalist. She had worked at Obsidian for 14 months, and she had watched a specific pattern operate at that door for most of that time. She could name 7 specific occasions on which she had seen black patrons turned away or redirected. She noted that the explanation given on those occasions varied. No reservation, a private event, capacity restrictions, but that the pattern itself did not vary. She had filed an internal complaint 6 months prior about the broader, discriminatory culture at the venue, including the fact that of 31 front-of-house staff members, 2 were black, and both of them were servers. Neither was a host, a manager, or a supervisor. Her complaint had been received, acknowledged, logged in the company system as resolved with no further action, and never acted on. She had kept the emails documenting the full chain. She provided them to the journalist. A second former employee came forward the following week. He had worked the door for 4 months before leaving, and he described being instructed by Preston directly on how to read the entrance line and make what Preston called calibration decisions about who would fit the Obsidian experience. The former employee said he had understood from his first week what calibration actually meant and had quit. He felt he could no longer absorb it. A third former employee came forward 10 days after that. She had worked in the events booking office and described a standing instruction that certain reservation names should be flagged for a secondary review that did not apply to other names. She had a paper record of one such flagging. She kept it. The Atlanta Business Chronicle ran a profile of the building on Meridian and 5th. They noted in the 3rd paragraph that the property was owned by Meridian 5th Holdings, LLC, whose managing member was Claudette Renee Okafor, whose commercial portfolio across Fulton and DeKalb counties was valued in the range of $40 to $50 million according to public tax records. They did not editorialize. The numbers spoke adequately for themselves. A reporter at a national outlet read the Business Chronicle piece and called Marcus Webb's office. She was working on a longer story about black wealth in Atlanta's commercial real estate market, about what it looked like when it was built quietly and held without fanfare, about what it meant to own the building in a city whose ownership history was long and complicated and could not be discussed honestly without talking about race. Marcus called Claudette and passed along the inquiry. She thought about it for 4 days. She said yes. The profile ran 8 weeks later in a publication whose readership numbered in the millions. It was titled The Quiet Owner. It ran with a photograph taken on a clear morning in front of the Meridian and Fifth Building. Claudette in her cream coat, looking directly into the camera, the brick behind her warm with November light. The sky above the building the particular blue of a cold Atlanta morning. The story described her portfolio, her methodology, her belief in what she called the compounding of quiet decisions. It described Vine City and Miriam's kitchen, and the spiral notebook, and the word land circled 3 times. It described Gerald Fairchild and the Decatur cellar, and the specific architecture of the obstacles that had been placed in her way and the specific patience with which she had gone around every one of them. She had insisted on being quoted sparingly. The reporter had pushed back. Claudette had been courteous and firm, as she was about most things, and the reporter had ultimately respected it. She was quoted twice. The first quote was this: "Property is not a metaphor in my family. It is the thing my mother wrote about in a notebook at the kitchen table every night for 30 years. I took that seriously." The second quote was this: "The building does not care who walks in the front door. That is the point of owning the building." The piece was shared widely and read carefully and translated into 3 languages by readers who found in it something they wanted to pass along. Something about the particular texture of building something real inside a world that preferred you didn't. Preston Caldwell's lease was terminated. The termination notice arrived from Marcus Webb on the 14th day after the Obsidian incident, signed with the measured formality of a letter that had been written carefully and did not need to be long. The notice cited the 3 unanswered compliance violations, the late payment and its relevant lease clause, and a 4th violation that the property manager's inspection had identified: an unpermitted modification to the HVAC routing on the 3rd floor, made without notice to the owner, in direct contravention of Section 7 of the lease. All of this was entirely legal. Preston's attorney confirmed this after his own careful reading. There was nothing to contest. Preston Caldwell vacated the building at Meridian and Fifth in the spring of the following year, after 2 rounds of lease extension negotiations that did not succeed. The negotiations had been conducted through attorneys, which was the appropriate forum, and the outcome had been determined primarily by Section 7 and the 3 certified mail receipts. He relocated Obsidian to a smaller space in Buckhead and posted a social media announcement about a new chapter. The announcement received fewer comments than any previous post in the account's history. His follower count was not what it had been. Janet, the HR coordinator who had filed Destiny's complaint in a drawer and typed resolved, "No further action needed," into the company system, was not retained when Obsidian relocated. Destiny Wright received a settlement from Obsidian Atlanta, LLC, for her discrimination complaint. The terms were confidential. She enrolled in the paralegal certification program at Georgia State University with a portion of the funds because she had spent 14 months watching how documentation moved through legal systems and had decided she wanted to understand the machinery from the inside. She kept her phone charged. She kept the emails. The 2nd and 3rd employees who had come forward both found new positions before the end of the year. The former door employee who described calibration decisions found work at a venue that did not use that vocabulary. He said the work was better. Meridian Fifth Holdings, LLC, did not leave the building empty. Following a renovation that addressed the ventilation system, the fire suppression line, the HVAC routing on the 3rd floor, and a number of deferred maintenance items that the property manager had been cataloging for 2 years, the building reopened 8 months after Preston's departure under a new arrangement. The ground floor became a community event venue. Rental rates were set on a sliding scale, with significant discounts for Black-owned small businesses and nonprofit organizations serving the Vine City and Mechanicsville neighborhoods. In its first 6 months of operation, the venue hosted a health fair, 4 small business networking events, 2 community organization fundraisers, a spoken word series, and a Spelman College alumni gathering that had been searching for an affordable space in that part of the city for 3 years. The second floor was leased to a consulting firm co-founded by 2 women who had graduated from Spelman 18 months prior and who were building a practice in community development finance. They had found the listing through a commercial broker who had flagged it specifically because the owner had indicated a preference for mission-aligned tenants. They signed their lease with Meridian Fifth Holdings, LLC, and when they looked up the managing member out of diligence, they sent a handwritten note to the address on file. Claudette read the note and kept it. The 3rd and 4th floors became a co-working space with a sliding scale membership, designed for entrepreneurs and small organizations working in the fields of housing, education, and community health. The walls had been left as they were, original brick, the same warm red-orange of a 1924 manufacture, because some things you do not cover up, you let them be what they are. On the wall near the main entrance, where the host stand and the velvet rope and the reclaimed bourbon barrel bar had been, there was now a small brass plaque, mounted at eye level, simple and without flourish. It read, Meridian Community Commons, built 1924, acquired and restored 2019 through 2024, in honor of Miriam Okafor, who wrote the word land on the inside cover of a notebook and circled it 3 times. Miriam Okafor attended the opening. She wore a blue dress and her good shoes. She stood in the doorway of the building her daughter owned, and she looked up at the original brick, the light coming through the original window frames in long, warm rectangles across the restored floor, and she pressed both hands flat against her chest and held them there. Claudette stood beside her. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The afternoon light fell across the floor, the way light falls across floors that have been standing for 100 years, with the patience of something that has seen many versions of the same room and does not judge any of them. The building had been many things in a century: a warehouse, a storage facility, an event space for the people who could afford it, and now this, a room where the door opened for everyone because the person who owned the building had decided, a long time ago on a Vine City street in a cold apartment with a rattling window, that the door should open for everyone, that the point of owning the building was exactly that. Man, I need a minute with this one, because this story is about a door, yeah, but it was never really about a door. It was about 100 years of somebody deciding who got to stand on the inside and who got sent around back. And one woman who took her mother's notebook seriously enough to make sure that the answer to that question, at least for this building on this street in this city, was answered differently. Now, this story is a work of fiction. Every name, every character, every institution in it was created to carry something true, not to represent any single real person or real event. But the truth inside it is not fictional. The truth inside it belongs to every person who has been looked past or looked through, told to go around back, handed a sentence that assumed they did not belong where they were standing. The truth inside it belongs to every person who has been dismissed before they finished their first sentence. And it belongs to every mother who sat at a kitchen table and wrote down what she wanted for her children and meant it like a contract. So here is my question for you today, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Has there ever been a moment in your life when someone looked at you and decided, in less than 10 seconds, exactly who you were, and they were completely wrong? Tell me in the comments. Tell me what that felt like, and tell me what you did with it. Because those stories deserve to be heard, and this community reads them. If this one sat with you, do what you do. Drop a like. Share this with someone who needs to feel this today. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the time. We are building something here. One story at a time, one door at a time, and we are just getting started. See you in the next one.